to thank you first for having me present at this conference. I was excited to go to New York City, but I'm not crazy enough to go to New York City right now. So I hope you guys are doing well over there. Donna decided to join me last minute yesterday. So she and I had been working on our team through the Department of Economic Security. We're operations. And so we work on a team where we have had to rapidly develop courses and flip the classroom. I come from a wealth of knowledge as well as Donna does, where we've had the theoretical background, but also the real world experience. If you see my cats, I apologize. There might be, hi. And so, yeah, I live in an apartment, so this is my office. And so, I really liked the other presenters and what they had to offer regarding virtual reality. That's something I'm very big on. I was a STEM educator, so I incorporated STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. I also was a computer science teacher where I did blended learning approaches with like Google Classroom. And so not just with my master's, which is in online learning, I had it where it was in person, it was also online, and then it was also the blended component. So I was working with real world organizations like Sandia National Labs for my degrees. And as I was doing that, I was working full time. So as some of the other presenters were talking about, master's level students usually are working full time and doing part time. And that's kind of how my journey started in 2008. And Donna, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself real fast and explain a little bit about your background, and then we can get going with the presentation.
I work with the Office of Professional Development along with Beth. I have been in training as an instructor for about 32 years, and I moved over into the design portion about 3.5 years. Was actually working on some self projects for about 7 years before that. I really look forward to listening to presentation that Beth put together regarding the projects that we worked on. I will be monitoring the chat and just chiming in as needed, but I'm going to turn off my video so you can focus in on Beth during the presentation period. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to chatting with you all.
And thank you, Donna. So at our organization, we've had to rapidly develop online, especially now in the midst of COVID. We went virtually about March. I was paying attention because I have a lot of friends in Italy on what was going on, in different parts of the world. But before that, with prior knowledge and existing expertise, I was foreseeing certain things that could possibly come down the pipeline. I identified in the organization that, for learning systems, what we needed to be looking at going forward as we have these stay-at-home orders. And really, with what we have done, because of our learning constraints right now, we have implemented Google as far as the learning mechanisms regarding instructor-led training, and having to see what would work, what didn't work, and go from there. Along with that, I also helped create an e-learning module for virtual office for supervisors. My colleague, Travis, he created the narration script, and me as the instructional designer, media designer, we created that course within 4 weeks. So I spent about 128 hours of time from the time I got the scripts, including the audio narrations. I'll talk a little bit differently on like how I've worked the process with the people and then the end all product, because I come from a world of working corporate, working higher education, but also consulting where I was working virtually. I worked with a Dutch organization in 2016 where I consulted on software simulation training for Microsoft Dynamics AX7. And most recently in 2018, 2019, before I started with the state of Arizona, I worked on an ERP system training that was fine-tuned for production, manufacturing, and the retail side. So there was a lot of systematic learning that was used in Camtasia. When I transferred over to the state of Arizona, we've been using Adobe Captivate and Camtasia. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that and how my process and Donna's process is. We have a little bit different of processes, but we're working together as a team and collaboratively bouncing ideas off of each other. And really, it's amazing to be not just the subject matter expert instructional designer, but actually working with not just our team that are instructional designers, but also there's about 60 of us with the state of Arizona. So I've been very thankful in this past year to bounce ideas from so many different people and me not just being the only instructional designer or the second instructional designer. So my organization is the Department of Economic Security. We do a lot of different things within the organization. It's not just the benefits that they receive, but especially with COVID, we have unemployment. So all the items that our state has had to deal with up training individuals, there has been a lot of systematic organizational change when it comes to just teaching online, for instance. We also handle things like Division of Developmental Disabilities. My background is a little bit where I actually do the compliance side of it. So I'm working on HIPAA, your OSHA, limited English learning proficiency. I've been in other countries and I've worked with international organizations. So I understand how it is very important to understand cultural aspects when it comes to these new learning technologies. And it's changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. I've seen it when I started in 2008 on this journey. I was dealing with the recession of 2008, and I discovered this instructional design program at the University in New Mexico. And it also gave me the ability to learn from people from all over the world. And it was a mix of different types of learning, in class, online, and then I could be in Denver, Colorado, working full-time and learning technology skills. And back then, when we're talking about the learning process, it was Stanford on YouTube. I was learning Java programming. So the MOOCs and the learning has really dramatically changed. And I've been embracing it. And I see a lot of currently where everybody's had to rapidly move everything online, reading articles of a philosophy instructor from San Diego who was very resistant to online learning. And I think that's partly a training or maybe a lack of understanding, because a lot of the times it's very overwhelming for teachers that are going from that instructor-led component to the online world. And the things that I've been telling and talking to my teacher colleagues about has been really learning that one tool first. So be it Zoom, some type of conferencing tool, you learn that, and then you start learning other things that you can incorporate. So be it maybe a whiteboard. And really what happened, and I'll talk about Google Classroom later, is we kind of switched gears because of the overwhelming component of technology and really keeping it simple. And I think that's going to help facilitate the instructor-led courses as virtual instructor-led and flipping that course. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about rapid e-learning in my process. I started using Articulate Studio in 2009, to Articulate Studio 2009 version in 2011. And then from there, I learned Adobe Captivate in about 2013, and as well as Articulate Storyline 1 and 2. I've been using Camtasia since about 2013. I learned a lot of things in my degree program that was video editing, and it was at the beginning stages, really, when these MOOCs were starting to come about. So I'm going to poll you folks real quick. See if that poll is coming out. Yeah. And what I want to ask you, if you do use e-learning software at your organization, be it Articulate, Storyline, Rise, Adobe Captivate, Camtasia, or maybe you use multiple, or you might use some type of Adobe product or Apple product. If you can list that out in the chat, that would be great, to kind of get an idea of people's knowledge.
One of them.
Okay. I'm familiar with the name. I haven't really utilized it that much. Okay. Well, I'm going to be talking about a few different softwares that I use regularly. Captivate is the big one that I use for e-learning builds. I've in the past worked with like the Dutch organization where the licensing is very competitive and affordable for somebody that is trying to consult, or if you're in a large organization such as we are government. So having that enterprise license is just a better fit cost-wise than say, let's say with Articulate, which I love, and they have pros and cons to them. And so you use Camtasia. Yeah, Camtasia is one of the ones that I really have used a lot, and I see the positives. And it depends really on what modality and what you're trying to instruct, because sometimes Camtasia is not the best thing, and like the other presenters have talked about, where it really depends on your needs. Adobe Captivate definitely has some shortcomings. I definitely love Articulate a lot more for my e-learning builds, but I also come from a programmer's mindset. So I think that's also something that when you're looking at software for like e-learning, for instance, I would say Captivate is probably a little bit high. There's a learning curve with it. I do have a process, and I will try to show that to you folks in a little while on kind of how I lay out slides and what have you. And then I'm seeing Google Slides. Yeah, I use Google Slides as an instructor. When I was teaching on Google, I use that when I'm working on collaboration. But as far as like, say, my builds, I'll use things like PowerPoint for my background on my learning. So yeah, we use various versions of these as well. So I'll be talking a little bit about Adobe products and then also sound engineering that I do, because sometimes organizations are limited in budget, and like Laura had talked about with voice narrations, to get high quality edits, and what she had to talk about with the software, I might use Audacity, but she might use a different type of software tool like Pro Tools or what have you. There's different ones out there, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But for this learning, I'm actually going to be talking more about the rapid component and how I build these screens out e-learning content. So best practices. I always like to talk about this first, because it is, without knowing where your path is going to lead. A lot of people want the mountain, and usually you can build the hill. And so that's my main thing that I always try to instruct individuals on, is that I can build the hill, and then I can build those little hills to make that mountain. So depending on time, resources, and availability from your stakeholders and subject matter experts will really dictate some of these builds. And so not everything is rapid, but I try to, as I'm going through, have a process, because I will have difficulty either finding items on shared drives. If you're using Google, say you're in the Google Drive, there is, you can search on the terms, but it's easier if you put them into their respective folders. And so I have a system where I'll show you, if we have time, where I actually set up an audio file, a video file folder, my slides, my images, and they're all separated out within that course I'm building and designing. And I have a thing that it comes from like the database programming background that I have, where I have file names. And when we're talking about extracting data or putting data into our learning management system or content management system, knowledge management system, could it be SharePoint? You want to have the correct file name for it. Certain things don't work properly in different systems. And so you may put something into, say, SharePoint, and then it'll have little characters that populate that you never intended for the file name. And so it makes it difficult for the other person that may be going in to rework or revise that learning. And so having that set agreed upon standardization helps when you're looking down 5 years down the line, what is going to work, what's not going to work. And Donna's saying in the chat, it's standard work. I've in the past used it. You can think of it as your policies and your procedures. So the procedure to do something step by step on saving files into their respective file folders and locating them on those drives. And then lastly, when I'm building out my courses and my presentations, I'm looking at the colors. And the way I look for colors is I will go up to, say, the yellow on this image, and I'm going to use an eyedropper tool that will pick out that color code, which is called a hexadecimal coloring code. And so when I'm really building out my courses, I'm envisioning what I'm seeing, but I'm also making sure to make note of the colors so that as far as the course design, look and feel is going to be across the board where it flows and it doesn't jump from one design to the next. And it really all depends. In presentations, it might be different than what I do with e-learning content. It's going to depend on the course or the learning that I'm building out. So again, like I said, that, there are pros and cons to different softwares. Some it's the cost, some is the learning curve. For the purpose of the session, I'm going to be talking about Captivate, really my process in that. Then after I speak about that, if I have some time, I can show tutorials that I do in Camtasia. Usually for Camtasia, it's the one-offs that I'm doing. At my last client that I worked for with the ERP stuff, we created these little 1 to 5 minute videos in Camtasia, and I narrated it, and then it was thrown onto YouTube. And then we imported that into the WordPress learning management system, and the videos were uploaded into that LMS. Graphic design is a very key point in any design that you're going to have. And again, it goes back to learning one tool at a time. There are free software out there like GIMP that I've used in the past, or even Microsoft Paint. If you have Microsoft PowerPoint, you can do amazing development as far as graphic design is concerned for your learning just by using the PowerPoint slide deck. I've been using Adobe products since about 2001, 2002. So I started on version 6, and now it's a creative suite in the cloud. And I learned Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign for a business graphics course. And at the time, I didn't think it was going to be so, it would come in so much like in handy, but it really is the commonplace and standards for individuals to know Photoshop and Illustrator that are designers building out e-learning. And I use Photoshop a lot for isolating, say, the picture of the person and incorporating that into my learning. Or I might use Illustrator to use the vectors, which they have the illustrations, and I can go in using that color of that yellow on that slide, the hexadecimal color, and then incorporate it into the design that I'm creating. My recommendation is always to learn PNG, that's the transparency image first with Photoshop, and then also learning JPEG if you're not on the graphic design component. And then after you learn Photoshop, you've kind of mastered it, then you can get into Adobe Illustrator and learn more about that. But I really think about technology and how one of the other speakers was talking about being overwhelmed. And I think a couple of them spoke about this, is the overwhelming of technology. And what I keep saying through these stay-at-home orders is just learn. If it's Zoom, learn that. If it's Google Classroom, learn that. And then you venture into Google Docs or Google Slides. But it's getting familiarized with that software first and foremost, because I know as a teacher, there's so many new tools you can use as a technology teacher. And I look back at those past experiences and, you know, I was even guilty of that, doing the blended classroom where I would teach and then do my instructor led. And then my students would do all their assignments through Google Classroom. And I would find all these really cool tools like making music through Python. And so I would be throwing students into that, or I would have students that were block coding. And depending on their levels of learning, I had 3 different levels. And so it can be done, but it's also having that grasp of technology. And I see with a lot of instructors is that they've been thrown into this. And so it makes it very difficult to learn all these things. And it definitely has that overwhelming component. So my best advice, you know, learn Photoshop first, kind of get the hang of that, then Adobe Illustrator.
One thing, Beth,
if you don't,
also, it's very important to, if you're an instructor and you're getting that material, familiarize yourself before you get into that classroom with that material, and make sure you kind of understand what that flow is. And that way, if students are struggling, you at least know what you kind of work through that, and you usually develop some tips. As designers, we are also adding tools to assist the facilitators during the courses to help them understand how that flow is supposed to happen. We're having meetings one-on-one with them to make sure they understand how we intended that course to be rolled out as well.
Yeah, it's definitely been a process. I think Donna and I and our team has really, you know, had to rapidly develop things offhand, but it's also the communication we have between each team member and our weekly meetings that we have to make sure that there's nothing anybody else might need assistance with and so forth, and finding out their availability. But to rapidly develop right now is I'll talk a little bit about educational technologists and how they play a role with getting people onboarded with online learning as well. So getting back to design components, you may have heard them or have actually used master template slides. As you see here on your screen, this is kind of the blank canvas that you start out with. Some people prefer to use it. It really is a preference. I typically will use just the slide deck itself to build out my canvas, is what I call it. I'm thinking of it as an artist kind of mindset of what I want to see, what I want to envision on the screen after I've received the narration script. So in PowerPoint, going back to PowerPoint, the reason why this is for the newer versions of PowerPoint. I think after 2016, they really started having the ability to create slides on the fly where they would auto-generate different designs. And so I use that tab a lot, the design ideas. It really does assist me with rapidly building out slides where I will save the background and as a JPEG, and then I import it into my Captivate file, for instance, or it will be through, I've used it in Camtasia as well. It's a time saver, like Donna was saying right there. And then that gets back to Captivate. Depending on the software you're using, a lot of times, even in sound and movie making software, you'll have things called layers. And I have a systematic process where I'll have my narration down here, and then I'll have my background. Then I'll have the words on the screen. And the reason I do that, and one of the other speakers was talking about embedding text. The reason I don't do that is also for learning needs. Students that may have hard of hearing, or they may be a non-native English speaker, I want to ensure that students are able to succeed within my courses, be it in class as a computer science teacher or an instructional designer. I want to give them the tools to succeed. And one of the reasons I do the text on the screen in my Captivate, rather than exporting or importing the PowerPoint slide deck into, say, Articulate or Captivate, is I want to make sure it's not flattened where a text reader could not read it. And so I'm constantly thinking about that as I'm building out my courses. Let's talk a little bit about sound engineering. I loved how Laura talked about narration and how audio quality is very key here. I've had to be in-house with the narrations. So as you can see here, there's a few different icons I have of software I've either used currently or I have used in the past. They all have their pros and cons. For rapid development for myself, how we usually do it is we will do the text-to-speech option within Captivate where the reader reads it out to us, and then I'll time my words on the screen coming up. And I use shortcut keys a lot for this. But it would be ideal to have like a voice narrator, but for the purposes of what I've experienced in the job field or even in the educational sector, I've had to do it in-house. So I do actually have my Yeti mic here. So this is what I use to record. I've actually had sound studios in the past, and I've worked with voice narrators for courses. It really all depends, but it can be done low budget. Also with VR, I think about the cost, and I've worked on things like the Cave, which is this, you point projectors into the corner and you're able to create an immersive environment on the cheap. So depending on your budget, you can do it effectively, but it's also somebody that understands how to do voice narrations rather than outsourcing. So what I do with my naming conventions is I'll put like an S01, 05, 06. And as I'm recording my audio, I take a couple seconds before, and then I start recording my narration. And I always try to find a quiet place. Ideally is a walk-in makeshift sound booth. I have a walk-in closet, and it even without having the foam that goes on the walls, I can still create an audio narration that sounds decent as an e-learning build. And I prefer that over the robotic voice. It definitely has a lack of personalization when you are doing the text to speech. But for what we do at OPD, we have so many projects we're working on, 60 designers, that for us to hire a voice narrator, or even for myself to do narrations, it's time consuming. And then if you have re-recordings that you have to do. So sometimes for our needs, it may just be the text to speech. I've seen the positives on both. I understand that voice narration has way better impact with the learning. But we've really had to rapidly develop items, and these are just-in-time learning. So sometimes when we're designing items within our organization, that's why we will use that robotic voice versus a voice narration. However, with the course that we did that was 15 minutes, the virtual office for supervisors, Travis spent a week. I gave my supervisor an guesstimation that for every 5 minutes, it takes me an hour to record. So I knew about 2 to 3 hours it would take me to do the narrations, crop it down, and so forth. That was for a 15-minute course. Now, when we're talking about larger course sizes, usually you want to segment those out, but if you can't fit it within that time frame, that's when we start getting into the text to speech and breaking them into parts. So really it all depends. And it's also depending on the organization I have worked for or my clients and their needs and what kind of software we decide to choose on to create those projects. And that's what I was talking about here is, voice narration versus text to speech. I don't think there's a lot of people that do like the robotic voice. I'm not a fan of it, but sometimes with the development process, it's best to get the content out, and then you can do fine-tune revisions after. So as you can see here on the screen, I have created an example in Captivate. So it's split up into different layers like I was talking about. The words on the screen that link to the teacher portal for Google, I've added to on top of the screen itself. So that's the layering component we're talking about here. And this also incorporates the audio. The reason why it's split differently, usually I'll keep the audio at the very bottom, is because I actually did this as a recording through a web conference through Google Meet. And so I was splicing and editing this out. So next poll question. Do you currently use a learning management system? So it looks like a majority of you folks do. Okay. So learning management systems, I've worked on a number of learning management systems. Some that would be considered learning management, some would be considered knowledge management systems like SharePoint. And then some are just content management systems. And for me as the data girl, I want to actually have data. And certain LMSs will have great data, and then some of them, you're not really factoring in all the other items that may come into play, like how many times they tried logging in and attempting the assessment, or, were they having difficulty on the discussion board, if that's something that was part of the learning journey. I initially, when I started out with this, I learned on Moodle. That was basically my first learning management system. Then I went into Blackboard. We, at the University of New Mexico, that's what I learned on. WebCT as well was another one that we used initially in the early days of my online distance learning classes that I would attend. Then from there, around 2015, I worked with a school, a university, and it was mostly medical side of learning, and they had the Canvas LMS. So I was an administrator for the courses there and was able to basically be that ed tech professional. As an instructor, I've used Google Classroom, and also it's a solution that we've had at our organization here at the state of Arizona. So we use another proprietary software, but we also use Google Classroom now that we've kind of had to switch to Google, the stay-at-home orders. So when I'm instructing the instructors, really I've been letting them go to this website. We've actually had to rapidly get them up to speed. And Donna and I were just discussing this at our last meeting, is that we realized that the teachers needed to be on they needed to learn one tool at a time. So we went from having Google Classroom, which some instructors are using, but they're also just using Google Meet, which is the conferencing side that you would have for Zoom, but it's on the Google platform with Whiteboard. So it made more sense for those instructors that were maybe teaching a critical thinking class to be on a Google Meet versus a Google Classroom platform. So it really all depends on how the teaching is going, but giving them the tools and then having the training solutions for them. And some of the items might be a quick how-to through Camtasia, but sometimes you might need to just direct the learner to, or the instructor to, the resources that are out there. Say for Camtasia, they have about 5 videos that I would instruct, individuals to go to learn Camtasia, so that they could get a kind of a learning curve onboarding before they started using the 30-day trial software and then decided to either buy it or not use it. But it's come in handy with those resources and knowing where to find that information. And really, that's where an educational technologist is so important for these learning journeys. This poll is, do you currently have somebody identified as an educational technologist at your organization? Okay, so about 50-50, 40%. Okay, yeah, 50-50. This could also be an instructional technologist or an instructional designer. Okay, so it's kind of split, and I'm not surprised by that. I've worked in organizations where I've been the only educational technologist, and then I've worked in organizations like currently where there's a few of us that are kind of the facilitators of educational technology. And the reason why I go to educational technology, it's not just designing your course objectives and your lesson plan, but it's really having somebody that can help you facilitate switching to online platforms. And I've worked with some of the instructors here where I sat in on their Google Meets and would assist them with posting the web URL to what they were referencing from their PowerPoint slide deck, so that the students could easily click on it, and assisting the instructor with any technical issues that may occur. And I think it's very imperative that educational technologists do play a role in your organization. Having that person that actually knows the information is going to help tremendously with getting these courses rapidly online and flipping the classroom. And sometimes organizations fail to realize that, or they have a misconception or misunderstanding on why that is important. And I would say, from my experience as learning management administrator, database administrator, these are things that we really need to be thinking about as we're rapidly developing this course content and getting it online. And I've seen where not even having lesson plans, a lot of the instructors that had their learning objectives and their lesson plans were ready to go quickly and rapidly, faster than the instructors that did not have that. So depending on your organization, the lesson objectives, knowing your pathway for learning is going to be key. But then also having somebody that can facilitate and assist with technology, because the teacher becomes that facilitator, going from just the passive learning in the classroom to now having to facilitate that learning. So that's all I want to kind of leave you with, you folks, on my rapid e-learning development. I can show examples, but I wanted to leave this up for any questions that you folks may have. And I wanted to thank you folks for listening, your time and listening to me. And I'm here for any questions. And so is Donna.
All right. If you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat. And if as we wait for that, if you do have, I know you mentioned examples a couple of times, but if you've got time to share those while we wait, it'd be great to see one of those. I think there's always help. So
let me share my screen. Hold on. Let me know when you can see it.
Still on the slides for now.
Share.
And there we go. Can see it. I can see. Yep.
Okay. So this has been updated, and Donna can talk about this, but we're working on an instructional design cert. And so I took the learning and created PowerPoint slides that Donna actually went in and revamped, I think. Didn't you put that,
yes,
that information together?
I took, we had, I believe it was 7 different people working on this project, and I kind of coordinated and put everything together into one cohesive course.
Yeah, so we had different people working on the content itself. And actually, let me see, in Google Classroom, we converted the instructor-led component to different topics: day 1, day 2, day 3 for instructor certification for instructional design. And so we've been working on converting PDF participant guides to editable PDFs so that the students can type within the documents, make their notes, and so forth. So it's been a joint effort as far as getting things online for the learners, depending on when and if we return back into the office. And it's sounding more like that we're going virtual.
The other thing is it makes it more interactive as well by incorporating, like Beth was saying, Google Meets with the whiteboard. In the whiteboard, you could split out activities, and that way all the students, you could assign them, or the facilitator can assign them maybe a group 1, group 2, group 3, and they could collaborate in that activity. And then we could all come together at the end, and the facilitator could cover the different points at the end. So it becomes more interactive. And that's kind of where we were bringing in some of those. Beth and I are in the gamification piece too, where it's not just you add a game or a leaderboard or badges to the thing. You're actually engaging that learner in an activity that's current for the course you're teaching. Yes.
So that meaningful learning.
Yeah, really quick, before we move to this, Donna, you mentioned 7 people were on the team.
Yes.
Can you tell us quickly what their roles were, as best as best as you can describe them?
Yeah, the course was broken up into different modules, And we had people that just started in design, and this was their first project that they worked on, down to people that have been with the agency for 25 years. So there was a big learning curve for some. And it's kind of really getting that mentorship and developing those people to get those design skills up to snuff, and then making sure everything was cohesive with the people that, you know, have the scripting and have that design elements down, and then the ones that are still struggling to learn it. So kind of building that teamwork and collaboration on that project was, it was a challenge, but it was a very good challenge. So.
Was it primarily 7 instructional designers at different skill levels, or was there more specialization? Okay, so
yes.
all generalists. They had some graphic skills. They could do PowerPoints, but it wasn't. You didn't have a PowerPoint graphics person. You didn't have a.
Correct.
It was everybody was kind of just with different levels.
Yeah,
okay.
As an instructional designer with our Office of Professional Development at DTS, we're hired in with a basic skill level, and then as you go through the trainings, you're mentored and building up additional skills. We have a design skills matrix that we use, where if somebody's very strong in one skill, they assist people that aren't as strong in another skill. So we're constantly trying to mentor and build up our skill levels in all areas.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Well, Beth, I didn't want to interrupt your example. I'd love to get back to that. I just want to ask the follow-up while Donna was on that. So
no problem.
Well, I can, let me share my screen real quick again. I'll bring it back to my rapid e-learning prototype.
Okay, and real quick, Beth, we do have a question coming in on the chat that may be relevant. So I'm going to interrupt you one more time, but I think it's relevant to this. Patrick asks, it says you talked a lot about the tools that you use to create the experiences. Can you talk a little bit more about the process, and maybe the prototype will be a good context for that? You know, what makes your process rapid, and can you talk about the process in general?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the courses that I've taught on. I've done a couple workshops with my colleagues, is rapid prototyping. So when I'm building out graphics, for instance, and kind of getting my look and feel of the course, I'm actually building a lot of it in PowerPoint, and then I may use Photoshop and Illustrator, but before, that's what I used to use. With the design ideas tab, it really gives me that ability to, when I'm putting out smart art, because I'm very anti-bullet points, it kind of, I just get like the glazy eyes when I'm learning something. Sometimes that bullet points can kind of detract from the learning. So this is actually like a bullet point inside of smart art. And it's actually created little icons for me as I'm building out ideas. It takes me about 2 to 3 weeks once I get the narration script. And then from there, I can start building out my PowerPoint as a template. And so I'll be setting up my images and then timing on the screen that goes into the Captivate file. And I've been making use of shapes. I've noticed with the pre-built items in Captivate or Camtasia, I'll probably use that. But if I'm trying to crop out like a person, you know, like my headshot, and do a circle around it, I may use Illustrator or I might use PowerPoint. And that gets into the cropping. So as you see here, these are different perspectives you can have on images. But depending on how you lay out the screen is going to direct the learner's
Another thing
eyes.
is we use a SAM2 process. I don't know if you're familiar with SAM. And it's an iterative process. So we may we do a savvy start where we're just getting the outline and the research and everything together. We meet with our client and we really make sure we understand what the goal and objectives for the course. Of approximation model, and we really make sure we understand what we're trying to accomplish and why we're trying to accomplish it. Then we go into the design portion, and at that point we come up with just a working model of what the course is going to look like. Then we go into a pilot, and with that pilot we then go into an iterative phase where we may do multiple revisions until that product is set according to what our client is expecting. And then we go into a final or a gold phase where it gets signed off, and then it goes into our learning system or into our SharePoint drive, depending on which type of course it is. So that's kind of the process that we use, but we kind of called it SAM 2 because it's more iterative than the normal SAM process. Hopefully that answers some of it.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Patrick says thank you as well. So yes, it did. All right.
Good.
Thanks so much.
So yeah, this is definitely like in the pilot phase or my prototyping phase. I was going to mention the SAM too, but Donna got to it. So thank you. And then these are kind of just slides that I've created where I take 2 images and I change them around on the screen. So depending on where my layout is going to be for the backgrounds, it's really going to dictate how my learning is going to be. And then bullet points like I talked about. And then talking about the Photoshop, Illustrator, and design.
Yeah, a lot of different. All right, a lot of different tools. Great. Are there other questions in the chat? But if not, and if you have more examples, we've got a couple more minutes if you want to show more. It's great to see the examples.
Oh, okay.
it's a rare opportunity sometimes.
Well, I was going to show you my business. And also the thing that I think this comes from my creative background. And if you can find a creative person, I try to not use the same template over and over again. Like I have that constant change, like design thought hat. And I think Donna's a lot like me in that sense, where we design something that is completely different than the previous e-learning builds. Because one, compliance training for me is boring. I've created scenarios where it was OSHA and learning about how to wear your PPEs, and it's boring content. And so I named the character after my mother, which was this relatable story where my mom almost died from tetanus. And so the reason why you wear PPEs. And so I took them on like basically a 7-branch scenario learning on the reasons why it's important to wear the proper protective equipment. But I had to figure out a way to make it creative, engaging. And that's where the time, I think, for me to write the scripts and me to write the stories out, that's where a lot of my time is ate up. And so I spend a lot more time thinking about that flow through the course of learning objectives. And then the last thing I usually do is pull the assessment questions, because I never like a trick question. And as an instructor, I did not like trick questions. And I always wanted my students to prove their knowledge. And when you're talking about project-based learning, I'm a big advocate for it. But when you're in the real world, or you're in an organization, or you're limited on the tools with your learning management system, you may or may not have that capability. And if you have something like Canvas, yeah, you can create a learning journey, but it really depends on the technology and the access of what you have at your disposal. So depending on that, you have to switch gears. And so as I built the scripts for OSHA, that was, 10-hour construction training and trying to make that interesting. And that's how I learned on Articulate. And from there, learning about wellness and software simulations. And what I like about Captivate is it does give you that ability to do the software training. And if you're an organization that's working a lot with, like, say, the retail, you might want the student to be engaged through that simulation. And again, it comes down to the tools that you have access to, because it used to be the thing with Flash animations, and Flash was the thing, and now that's an obsolete technology. And I even thought about it with my instructors when they were teaching me Flash. I'm like, why are we doing this in Flash? It should be in Articulate. So even the schools have that gap of training when it comes to e-learning, because I didn't have access to Captivate. I didn't have access to Articulate, but my classmate from Brazil, he had, through his work, he had Articulate Studio. So we actually built the assessment in articulate, and I built out the Flash. But it's really seeing, okay, will this work for us in the next 3 years or 5 years or 10 years down the road? And using the tools at your disposal, because I've been in organizations where we didn't have a budget. And so you have to think lean and mean in those sense. And it'd be ideal to have like a sound booth like I've had in the past, but you make do with what you have. And it's the ability to switch and think about, okay, this technology, but sometimes people just don't know where to start. And that's where the instructional designer kind of comes in and facilitates that. Or if you're working virtually and getting people up to speed with technology, that's where an instructional technologist or educational technologist would come in handy to really just kind of help facilitate that, especially with what we're doing
Yes.
in the midst of COVID.
We deal with multiple clients and multiple divisions within the state, and they're all struggling to convert all their courses to the virtual. So that's where we're running lean and mean, and we're getting that process out as quickly as possible with quality. And it's very important when we talk about assessments, just very quickly, make sure those assessment questions really tie into what were the objectives of the class. They should match. If they aren't matching, then there's an issue with it. There needs to be a cohesive thread throughout that. Why are they taking this course, and are they meeting those objectives, and how are we going to assess that need? Yes.
And feedback, and having the feedback, not just like, yes, you're correct on
Yes.
this answer. Well, why are you correct? Or, you know, with our virtual office for supervisors, it was, well, maybe just sending a text message if it's late notice for a meeting that you have virtually, because the person may or may not be on the email. Or they might be away from their computers, and just simple things that people can be thinking about that may or may not have thought about. Oh yeah, we're all virtual, you know, or the considerations of, like, you know, when I worked with Donna and she was down in Tucson and I'm in Phoenix and we're in person, but she's virtually. And now I realize, you know, the considerations of those teleworkers where we're not doing the face-to-face component like we used to, but then the individuals that are working virtually that are kind of being left out of that conversation because you don't see them in person. So it's the awareness has changed definitely in the past few months. And, you know, I've worked virtually before, so this wasn't too unfamiliar for me, but I've seen the growing pains and the learning curves with our colleagues. It's a new world, but it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess there's a lot of time pressure that goes with it. And I guess speaking of that, it's just about time. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and also for your participation. Hopefully you'll continue through tomorrow, and we'll see you more in the chat.
Oh yeah.
It's been great having you. Donna, thanks for checking in with us as well and contributing. It's great to have you here.
Thank
and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow as well.
you very much.